Good morning. It's Friday, May 2nd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 574 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. We're tracking some serious headlines this morning out of the region. Fires are still blazing in central Israel. A Gaza-bound flotilla in support of Hamas was attacked by a drone, presumably an Israeli drone. The IDF struck near the presidential palace of Syrian dictator Abu Muhammad al-Jolani as a warning to lay off the Druze, and another missile out of Yemen intercepted by the Israelis. Meanwhile, a big shakeup yesterday at the White House. Mike Waltz, a two-time guest on the FDD Morning Brief, and most recently the National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, is now set to become the next UN ambassador. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio is going to wear two hats. He's going to be National Security Advisor, at least for a time, while also serving as Secretary of State. Both are good moves. Mike will be great at the UN. The moral clarity and courage under fire that he exhibited as an Army Ranger and a member of Congress is what's needed to handle the jackals at Turtle Bay. And Rubio is among the sharpest people in the room in Washington, no matter what room you're in. It makes sense that he would be the first person since Henry Kissinger to serve as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. So no, I'm not unhappy with this shakeup, but let's not make White House personnel the big story. It's a distraction. Let's stay focused and get back to the business of countering our enemies. Today's guest is Frannie Block. She's a reporter at the Free Press who published a piece this week exposing the flow of Chinese and Qatari dollars into American universities. This is an issue that we track closely here at FDD, and I'm eager to pick her brain in just a few short minutes. A fourth round of talks between the United States and Iran, which was set to take place in Rome on Saturday, has been postponed. Things are getting a little feisty. Iran accused the U.S. of contradictory behavior and provocative statements. That came after Washington warned Tehran of consequences for backing Yemen's Houthis and imposed new sanctions. Here's where I remind you that Iran is the primary patron of the Houthis. The regime should be held to account. And while the regime may not like sanctions, the financial pressure campaign is neither new nor surprising. I have no idea whether we'll see another round of talks, but I can tell you this. These talks are really not that complicated. People talk a lot lately about things being non-binary. Well, guess what? This is binary. Either the talks yield a solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis or they don't. They either end the Iranian enrichment program or they don't. They either end Iran's ability to engage in weapons development or they don't. The U.S. proposal should be simple. End it all now or face the consequences. And those consequences are obvious, with massive amounts of U.S. military hardware deployed across the region. Iran knows what's up. They see the map, and they know their air defenses are shot thanks to the Israeli operations last fall. So let's dispense with the complexity, shall we? We don't need a fourth round of talks. No caveats, no sunsets, no side deals. We just need an end to the Iranian nuclear crisis, full stop. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, lots of action in the West Bank this week. Let's review. On Wednesday, 2 Israeli reservists were wounded in a roadside bomb attack in Samaria, also known as the Northern West Bank. The soldiers were carrying out a routine patrol when the explosion happened. Both men were taken to the hospital, and the IDF deployed troops to the area to track down the assailants. Earlier, the IDF arrested a man named Ali Samoudi during an overnight raid in Jenin. Samoudi is a well-known journalist who's worked for places like CNN and Al Jazeera. Back in 2022, he was injured by the gunfire that killed Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Why the arrest? According to the IDF, Samoudi might be affiliated with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and he's suspected of transferring money to the terrorist group. The IDF questioned Samoudi for about 30 minutes before transferring him to an Israeli hospital for health reasons. Man, if I had a shekel for every journalist in Gaza or the West Bank that had ties to terror groups, I could finally buy that shawarma pit I've had my eye on. Headline 2, the Trump administration came out with those new Iran sanctions I mentioned earlier today. 7 entities were slapped with sanctions on Wednesday. They're all involved in some way with the trade of Iranian petroleum and petrochemical products. 5 of the targets are based in the United Arab Emirates. And if you're watching this show regularly, you'll see that the UAE keeps popping up in this context, something to watch. Anyway, the sanctioned companies helped export more than $480 million worth of Iranian petroleum and petrochemicals to third-party countries. That probably means China, but the administration didn't specify. Target 6 was based in Turkey, and that's another common jurisdiction for sanctions that we talk about on this show. This company imported millions of dollars of Iranian petrochemical products, many of which came from companies that are already under U.S. sanctions. The 7th and final target was an Iranian cargo inspection company for buyers and shippers of Iranian oil, otherwise known as sanctions violators. These inspection companies help lower the risk of doing business. And headline 3, lots of Lebanon news. First, the IDF eliminated 2 Hezbollah operatives in separate strikes yesterday. The first guy was a member of the group's elite Radwan forces. The second was gathering intel for Hezbollah near the Israeli border. The IDF published footage of both strikes. Now, get this. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun says the Lebanese armed forces are now in control of more than 85% of southern Lebanon. Another security official reports the LAF has dismantled over 90% of Hezbollah's terror infrastructure across the country. I'm curious to hear what the Israelis have to say about that. Sounds a bit inflated to me, but still interesting nevertheless. All right, it's time for my conversation now with Frannie Block. If you're curious about foreign funding to American universities, Qatar's education city, or what all this has to do with the anti-Israel and anti-American campus chaos, this one's for you. Welcome to the program, Frannie Block.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Great to have you. Okay, let's start with what is and what is not allowed in terms of foreign funding in the United States in higher ed or maybe even elsewhere. I think it's important for us all to understand that before we talk about what you've uncovered.
Right. So foreign countries and foreign donors have been giving money to American universities probably for many more years than we even realize. But back in 1986, the United States government passed Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. And what this basically declared is that any donation from a foreign government, whether that's actually from the government or from a donor in a foreign country, that's above $250,000 needs to be reported in a federal database. I believe they have to report it like twice a year. And so that's kind of where we're at now in terms of what is required by law is that universities can take in these foreign funds, but they need to be reporting them to the government so that the government can track them and make that available to the public.
Right. And I believe that the Department of Education, which may now soon be dismantled, has not done a particularly good job of tracking these funds in recent years. And those numbers have gone up, which then brings us to your piece. What were the major findings in terms of foreign funders and the institutions receiving foreign funds in the United States?
Yes, you're exactly right. My findings show that in the last 4 years, foreign funders have donated as much to U.S. universities as they did in the previous 40. So in the past 4 years alone, that is $29 billion, billion with a B, going into our American universities. So that's nearly 50% of all historical funding that we've been tracking since 1986. So I think what this shows is a huge explosion of foreign funding in the past 4 years. And a lot of that money, shocker, is coming from authoritarian countries like China and like Qatar. And we're seeing actually Qatar is the largest historical source of foreign funding. I'm looking at my notes only because I want to get these numbers right. It's $6.3 billion that we've been able to track through these public databases since 1986. China comes in second at $5.6 billion. But what's important to note here is that the majority of the funding, or at least a really large chunk of the funding from both China and Qatar, has come in the last 4 years. So Qatar's $6.3 billion total, over $2 billion just in the last 4 years. China, that's over, again, $2.3 billion just in the last 4 years going into U.S. universities.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. And I guess you got to ask it out loud. What do these authoritarian countries want with our education system, right? I mean, you could maybe argue that they're trying to buy access for some of their students. You can just, apply and then pay cash for your tuition. So what is it that they're trying to do? Are they trying to influence the way that we're teaching our kids? Are they trying to influence the administrators? There's a lot that I think we have not been really able to answer yet. But let me ask you, if you would, to specifically talk about Qatar. Talk to us about Education City and what Qatar is doing in terms of buying influence in higher ed and even K through 12.
So you're exactly right. There's actually a lot of more questions than answers that we have about what foreign countries are wanting to do by giving so much money to U.S. universities. But I do think Qatar is a great kind of case study to try to understand how an influence campaign in American education could work. So I mentioned before over $6.3 billion just going into U.S. universities that we can track. A big chunk of that money is actually going to fund something called Education City in Doha, Qatar's capital. And Education City, Qatar has given hundreds of millions of dollars to different U.S. universities, really prestigious ones, to establish campuses in Doha. You've got Northwestern School of Journalism. And again, looking at my notes, I think they got over $600 million to establish their School of Journalism. There's Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs, Carnegie Mellon's University's School of Computer Science, Texas A&M's Engineering Campus, Cornell's Medical School. So these are really prestigious American universities that are getting massive subsidies from Qatar to establish university campuses in Doha. I think that does raise a lot of concerns, particularly when you look at the boards of these universities. You start to see that there are members of the Qatari government serving on the advisory boards of the Qatari campuses. What does that make you think about kind of academic freedom, for example, on those campuses? There's other concerns as well, like gender equality in Qatar. What does that mean for a college campus in Doha? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these different questions. Qatar does not have the same values as the United States and as the West when it comes to those freedoms. And so what does that mean on a college campus? Now, on K through 12, you also have groups like Qatar Foundation International. This is a subsidiary of Qatar Foundation, again, run by a member of the Qatari royal family. And Qatar Foundation International is also pouring millions of dollars into our K through 12 schools, also universities, but K through 12 public schools in the United States. Last year, I reported on a story in Brooklyn. There was a map hanging on a wall in a Brooklyn public school, and that map was a map of the Middle East that completely wiped Israel off the map. There was no sign of Israel on this map. And again, this is hanging in a public school classroom in an elementary school in Brooklyn. It turns out that classroom is actually a program funded by Qatar Foundation International, and it's a language and arts program. And they've been giving, since over the past 5 years, over $1 million to the New York City Department of Education alone. I think that raises a lot of questions. There's even a picture of the head of Qatar Foundation, again, a member of the Qatari royal family, visiting this Brooklyn public school and reading books to children.
Yeah, I got to say, this all makes me really nervous. I think folks that have been watching this program know how I feel about the Qatari regime. But let's just remind folks that we're talking about a regime that sponsors and funds Hamas. They sponsor and fund the Taliban. They're the world headquarters for the Muslim Brotherhood. They have been found to be harboring Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists and operatives on their soil. This is not a regime that you want influencing your K through 12 or higher ed. It's a huge problem. And somehow we've just allowed this to continue in this country. And I do hope that some of what you've reported is starting to sink in U.S. government circles. I know there's some legislation that's potentially looming called the Deterrent Act that would force disclosure at even a lower level. In other words, that $250,000 limit would be reduced, and we would see even more disclosures. But we have a lot more to learn, I think, about how much the Qataris have infiltrated the United States education system. Frannie, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing out of China. There's a large amount of money there too, right?
Absolutely. So China, as I said before, one of the biggest donors to American universities, $5.6 billion. And they're a major funder to schools like Harvard, for example, some of our most prestigious universities. And again, this is a country that values-wise is very much at odds with many of the kind of Western liberal values that the United States is based upon. And so I do think, again, this raises a lot of other concerns. And there's been a lot of reporting in the past, for example, on Confucius Institutes. These are kind of Chinese language learning institutes that were on college campuses before. All of a sudden, it came out that those institutes were actually vehicles through which the Chinese Communist Party was trying to influence Americans and the American education system. So I do think this requires a much greater deal of scrutiny for us to understand where's this money really going in universities and what's it actually doing.
Yeah. All right. Just a question about correlation. You've tracked now the foreign funds at a bunch of these schools. Have you seen a correlation between these foreign funds and the anti-Semitism that we've witnessed on campuses across the United States since the October 7th attacks?
Yeah, so there was actually a peer-reviewed study published by the Network Contagion Research Institute, NCRI, and they are actually kind of our partners in being able to put this report out. And NCRI found in their study that there was actually a strong correlation between money coming from authoritarian regimes and the rise of anti-Semitic incidents on campus. Now, this is a correlation, right? Not a causation. They're not saying they're directly, we can say that X causes Y. But what we can say is that this raises some red flags and it deserves some greater scrutiny. Is foreign funding fomenting greater chaos on our university campuses? And I think NCRI's findings show that we really need to look at that question harder.
Yeah, I've long argued, at least for the last year and a half, that the amount of money that's coming in from sovereign wealth, what it's done is it's obviated the need for these schools to rely on the traditional alumni networks. And these alumni networks, they're important, right? These are Americans typically that have graduated from these schools that have a lot to say about the culture that they want to create on the campuses that they once attended. And when you have these larger checks that basically make these alumni networks irrelevant, that's when I think you begin to see the breakdown. And I do think that that probably has something to do with the spike in anti-Semitism. If you're only answering to countries like Qatar or China and not to those networks, I think you've got a problem. But that's just my opinion. You've been on campus for some of these protests, and I'm just curious if you've got just anything you want to share with us about what you've seen during some of the times that you've been reporting from schools.
Yeah, so being on campus, what struck me the most about witnessing some of these protests is the kind of anti-American undercurrent, the anti-Western liberal value undercurrent that kind of goes through the chants and goes through the posters that you see, people masking, trying to hide their identities, not actually wanting to show who they are, but really just wanting to espouse these beliefs that as a viewer, you're not necessarily convinced that they know that much about it. When you start to ask students about it, they actually don't want to talk about kind of why they're there protesting. They're also very organized. So again, if I go up to a protester as a journalist and say, "Hey, like, tell me about why you're here today. Why do you want to be protesting this? Tell me about why this is important to you." They'll say, "I'm not allowed to talk. You have to go talk to our comms person." So these different protests, they have communications people and they have organizational structures, they have organizers that are at the head of this, and you also have to imagine they have people who are writing checks and making sure that they can afford all of the supplies that they need. Actually, just last week I reported on a story, two janitors at Columbia University who were actually held essentially hostage inside of a university building when students and outside protesters broke into it. They're suing all of those protesters, over 40 people, saying that they assaulted them, they battered them, and they left them with irreparable harm, PTSD, all of these types of injuries that they still haven't been able to return to work. And as a part of their lawsuit, they detail actually how these groups like the People's Forum, which is a nonprofit based in New York City, funded by a guy with over $20 million who's living actually in China, the People's Forum actually was helping them every step of the way, giving kids supplies, crowbars, duct tape, teaching them how to break into buildings, how to barricade yourself inside, all this kind of stuff. So I think their lawsuit actually shows a lot of insight into, frankly, how organized these protests are. They aren't spontaneous, but they're very deliberate. And what they're doing and the chaos that's ensued is very deliberate.
Yeah, this is, we've been saying it from the beginning, neither spontaneous nor organic. I think we can say that with certainty here. And, I think you point out one group that is providing that assistance. We've actually identified others. American Muslims for Palestine has been a big one as well. So we're going to all continue to track those. Last question before I let you go. We have a program here at FDD on education and national security, and we're always looking at ways to make the funding streams more transparent for the U.S. government. Have you looked at, obviously you've had to navigate this. If you could point to one area where you'd just like to see more transparency, where would that be?
Well, I think right now, right, Trump just signed an executive order essentially enhancing the government's accountability mechanisms to make sure that universities are complying with disclosing where they're getting their foreign money. But I think I do have some concerns about back channels, back doors. Universities can get money in a lot of different ways, and they can money can come through nonprofits, it can come through think tanks, and that necessarily can't necessarily be tracked through Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. So that's one area where I do hope that the federal government starts to kind of lay more scrutiny on those back channel ways of getting money. But the other thing I'll add is that in terms of transparency, we may know that money's coming in, but we don't know exactly where that money's going once it reaches a university. And I do think that's a super important point, especially if we want to start, scrutinizing what could be impacting chaos on campus. We have to understand, is it this money? We have to know where that money's going on campus. What programming is it funding? Is it funding student groups? Is it funding particular departments? Is it funding outside, groups that are influencing university students? We need to know answers to all those questions, but to be able to, it starts with actually forcing universities to disclose those greater details.
Yeah, it's time for these schools to come clean. And I'm hoping that that is one of the outcomes of the pressure that we're seeing now being placed on these universities. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Frannie Block, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks so much.
All right, that was great. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Annie Fixler testified before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe about the future of American cyber diplomacy. In her first ever testimony before Congress, Annie rocked it. She explained how our adversaries are weaponizing cyber to harm U.S. national security and challenge American leadership. To combat malign cyber activity, the U.S. needs to go on the offensive. A robust cyber bureau at the State Department, Annie says, will be critical to winning in cyberspace. Bridget Herbst, the deputy director of FDD's new Education and National Security Program, published an insight on FDD's website exposing nefarious pro-Hamas activity in K-12 schools. A coalition of union groups called Labor for Palestine encouraged teachers in New York and California to stage a general strike on May 1st. That's May Day. Bridget warns that labor unions are becoming vehicles for anti-Israel activism, and our leadership at a state and local level need to make sure that American kids aren't being used as terror-lauding pawns. Finally, my colleague Georgiana Shea has a piece in Defense News on why the Defense Department needs to modernize its software. George warns that the next time one of our adversaries discovers a software vulnerability, the Pentagon may not know until it's too late. She recommends that the Pentagon balance speed with safety as it acquires new software. All right, stick a fork in it, folks, because we're done. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, or take a look at our X, Instagram, YouTube channels. And please feel free to make that generous, tax-deductible donation to our mission at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another riveting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, enjoy your weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.